People are constantly discussing affordability these days. It has turned into the defining term for an entire generation of individuals aged roughly 20 to 40 who feel overwhelmed and stifled by contemporary economic pressures. These individuals watch their aspirations crumble because they lack sufficient funds to purchase homes, cannot afford quality family vacations, and struggle with rapidly increasing healthcare expenses. This situation connects directly to fundamental questions regarding economic function and power structures. However, the situation becomes remarkably bizarre and somewhat absurd when examining the reasoning from progressive politicians and the Democratic political leadership. Their logic appears so convoluted and contradictory that comprehending their arguments becomes genuinely difficult. Allow me to outline their position so the absurdity becomes apparent. During 4 consecutive years while they held power, the nation suffered severe hyperinflation that devastated working-class households and obliterated personal savings. Inflation reached a catastrophic peak of 9.1% in 2022, and when calculated across those difficult years, it remained consistently above 5%. These aren't merely abstract statistics, but represent actual individuals witnessing their earnings lose value while their food costs seemingly doubled instantaneously. Yet consider the perverse logic they're now promoting. They possess the boldness to criticize Donald Trump for experiencing inflation rates between 2.6 and 2.7% throughout his initial 10 months returning to office. Consider how irrational this criticism truly appears. They're actively condemning him for failing to immediately resolve the catastrophe they generated through irresponsible spending and poor policy decisions. They're asserting he bears responsibility for not miraculously eliminating their errors with sufficient speed to satisfy them. Their entire approach appears centered on this backwards philosophy. They intend to block him legislatively at every opportunity, and they're already organizing their 2028 campaign based on arguing that their policies, which initially produced the hyperinflation, deserve another opportunity because Trump hasn't reduced prices to former levels rapidly enough. They're fundamentally demanding he should have produced not merely moderate or low inflation, but literally zero inflation instantly, something they themselves never managed to achieve. The audacity of this strategy is astounding upon reflection. They severely damage something, observe its collapse, then criticize the successor for not immediately repairing their damage while simultaneously attempting to obstruct his corrective measures. That represents their complete strategy currently, and they're hoping people won't recognize this deceptive game they're conducting regarding economic accountability. Another vital aspect of this situation requires attention and comprehension. The Trump economy presently faces what might be characterized as a high-pressure race against limited time. This race carries exceptionally significant implications because only 1 year remains before the pivotal midterm election referendum occurs. These approaching midterms will fundamentally differ from conventional midterm elections previously witnessed, and the explanation is straightforward. The Democratic Party has metamorphosed into something entirely unrecognizable from its previous form. This bears no resemblance to your grandfather's Democratic Party whatsoever. What exists now essentially constitutes a radical, Jacobin-style neo-socialist faction that has captured party control and propels it toward extreme positions that would have seemed impossible merely 10 years ago. The consequences couldn't be more critical because if Donald Trump surrenders House of Representatives control during these midterms, the ramifications will be swift and harsh. Within literally 1 week, possibly sooner, he'll confront impeachment proceedings. This isn't conjecture or alarmism, but an absolute certainty based on their statements and actions. Those impeachment proceedings won't conclude quickly either. They'll extend for weeks, stretching into months, monopolizing news coverage, and exhausting governmental focus. They'll make the recent government shutdown appear trivial by comparison, merely a slight disruption. The entire agenda will become paralyzed, progress will completely stop, and disorder will prevail. Therefore, the urgent question emerges: how does he avoid this catastrophic scenario from materializing? Fortunately, the groundwork is actually quite stable when examining genuine statistics rather than media distortion. We currently possess a reasonably robust and sound economy despite pessimists' predictions. Inflation hovers between 2.6 and 2.9%, which is controllable and nowhere approaching the emergency levels previously experienced. It'll likely average approximately 3% annually when everything is calculated, though final figures won't be available for some time. GDP growth is anticipated to reach roughly 3% annually, representing substantial expansion in economic vitality. Although, fascinatingly, the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank has indicated it could potentially achieve 4%, which would be exceptionally positive news for everyone. The stock market continues reaching unprecedented record peaks, meaning retirement funds are expanding and investor optimism remains elevated. Recall all that media panic and alarm we endured throughout the spring period? They declared with complete certainty that the economy was approaching total collapse. They forecast absolute catastrophe and described apocalyptic outcomes. Well, what occurred? They were entirely and completely incorrect about everything. We didn't experience a ruinous tariff trade war that obliterated the international commercial framework like they continuously proclaimed. We didn't observe a disastrous trade conflict with China that destroyed the economic relationship between our countries. We didn't witness a stock market crash that eliminated trillions in value. Actually, as mentioned, the reverse occurred with markets attaining record levels. We didn't enter a recession despite numerous economists and media commentators claiming it was unavoidable and approaching. Every single catastrophic prediction proved false, deceptive, or intentionally amplified for political objectives. So, what must the Trump administration absolutely achieve during this vital race against the midterm deadline? There are multiple essential goals, perhaps three primary objectives that must succeed to ensure victory and avert disaster. First and most importantly, the administration must continuously remind the American population that the economic performance accomplished within merely the first 10 months is considerably and substantially superior across virtually every quantifiable measure compared to what transpired during 4 lengthy years under Biden's administration. The difference is dramatic when examining the evidence honestly. You produce an extra million barrels of oil in just 10 months, and suddenly gasoline prices decline substantially. Last week, the average cost per gallon was $2.98. Compare that to the $3.46 average under Biden's policies. That's a spectacular and remarkable accomplishment, reducing gas prices by nearly 50 cents per gallon, which translates to genuine money returned to people's wallets each time they refuel their vehicles. However, here's the frustrating element. That incredible achievement isn't receiving appropriate coverage or recognition in mainstream media because it contradicts their preferred story. The subsequent vital task involves reminding everyone that the left is actively and intentionally conducting a coordinated campaign to halt progress in this economic race. Their objective is transparent. They want to stagnate this economy before the midterms arrive so they can assert things aren't functioning. How precisely are they implementing this sabotage approach? They're executing it by engineering the longest government shutdown in American history. The entire situation was completely illogical when examining what the Democrats actually accomplished and their motivations. Seriously, they had repeatedly voted previously for continuing resolutions without reluctance, and Barack Obama himself had delivered passionate addresses about the immorality and fundamental wrongness of shutting down government, describing it as nearly illegal to utilize shutdowns as political instruments merely because you lost elections and didn't control House majority. Then there's the complete Obamacare subsidy situation to contemplate. When Obamacare was implemented in 2010, we were continuously assured it wouldn't require subsidies and would remain self-sufficient through market mechanisms. Almost immediately following implementation, those assurances were revealed as untrue. It was demonstrated to be precisely what critics had anticipated all along, a bankrupt concept requiring enormous multi-billion-dollar subsidies merely to continue functioning. The Democrats succeeded in obtaining those subsidies approved, but they incorporated a sunset provision stating the subsidies would eventually terminate once Obamacare supposedly became more market-oriented and effective. That evolution never materialized, not remotely. So for all those reasons and additional ones, they shut down government and generated disorder. However, let's be entirely truthful here. That wasn't the genuine reason behind their conduct. The actual purpose, if you're being honest, wasn't about producing immediate disorder with government employees in Virginia during recent elections, though that was certainly advantageous for them. More significantly and tactically, it was engineered specifically to decelerate the economy and create resistance to expansion. The identical principle applies to Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve's decisions. For reasons that appear politically driven rather than economically justified, Federal Reserve members who control interest rate policy seem reluctant to reduce rates so that regular Americans could secure 30-year mortgages or 15-year mortgages at reasonable 4 to 5% rates and actually afford purchasing homes. I truly don't comprehend why this opposition exists unless it's political, but the pattern is unmistakable and authentic. There are simply no genuine indications that we're currently experiencing a hyperinflationary environment like what we endured during the Biden years. Inflation is positioned at acceptable levels. Economic expansion is positive without being so vigorous that it provokes runaway inflation. There are even some encouraging signals with tariff revenue collection and DOGE spending reductions, demonstrating that budget deficits are finally being handled appropriately instead of spiraling uncontrollably. They're not increasing anymore, which is enormously important. So there exists absolutely no legitimate economic justification not to address interest rates and reduce them to assist families. Yet Donald Trump finds himself battling conflicts on numerous fronts simultaneously. He's battling against the Federal Reserve's persistent opposition. He's battling the economic harm from the lockdown approach. And he's battling this continuous media story asserting he caused hyperinflation and that we're heading unavoidably toward recession. What must he accomplish to prevail in these conflicts? It's actually quite simple and clear when considering the next year strategically. Trump must plainly and consistently express this straightforward comparison. This was what the Biden record resembled for 4 painful years. This is what I have achieved in just 2 years of effort. This was the terrible disaster Biden abandoned for me to resolve, and this is precisely what I'm going to accomplish moving forward to improve things further. He needs to emphasize that message continually until it penetrates the media barrier. Then ultimately, he must effectively convey and explain that numerous policy agendas are structured for long-term transformation rather than immediate solutions. They're not intended to demonstrate results immediately, but are constructing foundations for sustained prosperity. By that, I mean he's tremendously expanding federal land leases for energy development. He's aggressively removing regulations from the Interior and Energy departments, eliminating bureaucratic obstacles that restricted development. We've already observed oil production increase by 1 million barrels during just 10 months, but forecasts indicate we'll probably witness increases of 2 or even 3 million additional barrels. That's going to produce a dramatic and considerable impact on energy prices by reducing them significantly for consumers and businesses. He's also advocating strongly for expanded natural gas utilization and electrical generation and encouraging construction of numerous new nuclear power facilities for clean, dependable baseload electricity. What we're definitely not going to continue doing is squandering taxpayer funds, subsidizing inefficient and extremely expensive wind and solar initiatives like we foolishly did previously. That energy policy modification alone will produce measurable beneficial impacts on electricity expenses. We have never successfully deported throughout our entire history 2 million people, either through direct enforcement or encouraging voluntary self-deportation. We accomplished precisely that this year, and we're positioned to equal or surpass those figures next year. That will ultimately signify 3 to 4 to possibly 5 million people who are no longer utilizing taxpayer resources through social welfare programs that prove remarkably expensive at state, local, and federal levels. Furthermore, they will not be claiming jobs from American citizens who require employment. You'll effectively have 4 or 5 million people extracted from the workforce who frankly should never have been in that workforce illegally initially. That transformation will produce enormous positive impacts on the economy, job accessibility, and wage increases for citizens. There are thrilling new technologies appearing rapidly that will revolutionize our economic environment. Artificial intelligence, sophisticated robotics, genetic engineering advances, and as mentioned, multiple new nuclear facilities becoming operational. All of these revolutionary technologies have been authorized and expedited for implementation. Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and innovators are completely supportive of these projects and investing substantially. These technologies will begin producing and demonstrating genuine results soon. If even one third of Donald Trump's $15 trillion in pledged foreign investment gets solidified and realized into actual projects and infrastructure, that alone will begin producing substantial long-term beneficial impacts on employment and expansion. The tariffs have already generated $400 billion in revenue, with forecasts indicating perhaps 400 to 500 billion total. Compare that to the final year of the Biden administration when tariff revenue was merely $77 billion. If Donald Trump takes that 400 billion in tariff funds and intelligently allocates it directly to decreasing the deficit rather than simply distributing checks for $2,000 to 200 million people, then that will produce a significant and powerful impact on financial markets, Wall Street confidence, and bond markets. Investors will recognize clearly that the president is earnestly utilizing $400 billion of tariff revenue to authentically decrease the deficit and prevent the dangerous proportion of federal debt relative to GDP from escalating. That fiscal accountability will prove extremely reassuring to investors and strengthen the dollar. Bottom line, and this is essential to comprehend, Donald Trump is participating in a race against time to communicate his message effectively. He needs Americans to recognize that the economy has already substantially improved compared to the Biden economy across virtually every measure. It's going to become dramatically superior as policies achieve full implementation, and people absolutely must not accept the media stories because the media, similar to the Democratic shutdown and the Federal Reserve's manufactured efforts to maintain interest rates elevated, are politically motivated rather than accurate. However, if everything proceeds the way he has meticulously planned, and if he continues implementing the correct actions at the appropriate times, then right around midterm election time, the economy is going to surge spectacularly and validate his complete approach to economic policy and leadership.